Hello, money and banking students. Our focus this week in Chapter 14 is the central bank. And of course, in the U.S., we know the central bank to be the Federal Reserve Bank. But we'll also take a look at central banks in other countries. In the first section of the chapter, we'll address three questions. What is a central bank and why is central banking important? How can a country manage without a central bank? And what is the history of central banking in the United States? Central bank has several roles. Probably the most important is controlling the money supply. And we talked about that earlier in our class, that they can increase the money supply or decrease the money supply by buying or selling bonds. Another goal is to keep prices level, to control inflation. They want to keep the economy running smoothly. Also, regulating commercial banks and other depository and non-depository institutions. Stabilizing the macroeconomy. And providing a payment system. They do the check clearing and long-distance payment processing. Federal Reserve is also the bank for the national government. When you read the chapter, you will learn the history of the central bank in the United States. And I think it's interesting to note that between 1837 and 1914, there was no central bank. But since 1914, the Federal Reserve has been the central bank of the United States. It's interesting to note that during that time period when there was no central bank, the role of the government's banking and clearinghouse was delegated to the private sector, and bank regulation fell to the state governments in the markets. Money supply was basically governed by supply and demand, with commodity money tied to gold. Two of the problems that surfaced when there was no central bank was there was no official lender of last resort. So think back to the 2008 crisis. Had there not been a Federal Reserve to inject capital into the market, the crisis would have been much worse than it was. Also, there was nobody to increase the money supply or lower interest rates when that was desperately needed to stimulate the economy. Basically, an economy could get by without a central bank if these conditions were met. As you can see, the time when there was no central bank in the U.S., there were several severe panics, recessions, and deflation periods during that time. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act established the Federal Reserve System, and it's been in operation ever since. At this time, I'm going to ask that you pause these narrated PowerPoint slides and view what is a central bank. This video is posted in Moodle for you. So what is the structure of the Federal Reserve System? There are 12 district banks, and you can see they are all over the country. And you'll also notice that Missouri has two Federal Reserve banks, one in Kansas City and one in St. Louis. Federal Reserve district banks are owned but not entirely controlled by each member bank in their district. All nationally chartered commercial banks and any state banks which choose to join the Fed system. The members elect 6 district bank directors, 3 professional bankers, and 3 non-bank business leaders. The 3 directors are appointed by the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. The 9 directors then, with the consent of the board, appoint a president. So what do the 12 district banks do? Well, one of their prime responsibilities is they are the ones that distribute new Federal Reserve notes. They're the ones that replace worn-out currency with new bills. In fact, had we been able to go to the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago, one of the souvenirs that they give you is a bag of shred that is basically worn currency that's been shredded, because when old currency comes in, they replace it with new. The Fed also is the clearinghouse for checks. They lend to banks within their districts. They act as a liaison between the Fed and the business community. They collect data on regional business and economic conditions, and they conduct some monetary policy research. They'll evaluate bank mergers and new bank applications, and they examine bank holding companies and state chartered member banks. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York has additional responsibilities. They are the bank that conducts all the open market operations, the buying and selling of government bonds. And of course, they have that responsibility because originally, all that was done on Wall Street, and so being physically present near the markets was important. Now, with electronic trading, it's not as important, but still, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York has stayed in charge of open market operations. They're a member of the Bank International Settlements Committee, and they safeguard all $100 billion in gold owned by the world's major central banks. Federal Reserve Bank of New York's president is the only permanent member of the FOMC. So what are the roles of the Federal Open Market Committee? Well, they're the ones that decide monetary policy and control the money supply. They also set the Fed funds target rate, and that's the rate that banks are charged when they borrow from the Fed, the discount rate that banks charge each other, and also the reserve requirement. Federal Reserve is governed by a board of governors. There are 7 governors appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They come from the different Federal Reserve districts, and they can serve for a single 14-year term. The chair is selected from among the governor and serves a 4-year renewable term. The Fed also has its own economists on staff, and they provide the chair and the FOMC with data, assessments of trends, and quantitative output from the latest microeconomic models. They examine what's going on with the global economy, foreign exchange market, look for possible shocks that could strain the system, and help the district banks to investigate market and competition conditions, and they provide education and public outreach programs. The Federal Reserve Chair plays an important role and is kind of the spokesman for the Fed, has a very distinct impact on money supply and interest rates, and basically controls the reserve requirements and the discount rate. The Fed Chair is the Fed's public face and voice, and is the major liaison to the national government. So that's a little overview of the first part of the chapter. I'll come back with a second video here shortly.